Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. I'm Nathan Weinstein, and I'm joined, as always, by a guy who we thought was located in Massachusetts, but it turns out that his signal's actually coming from inside Arsenal Gear. That's right, everybody. He is an AI here to save us from the internet. It's Brian Counter.
Oh man. Hi, how's it going?
What's up, man? I re-listened to our first Metal Gear Solid 2 episode this morning over coffee, and I think at one point I say like next week we'll talk about this, and it's now what like 6 weeks since that episode, so um, just a function of podcast scheduling and also just like gameplay schedules. But we are back to talk about the end of Metal Gear Solid 2, and for those who feel as cheated, maybe as cheated as Metal Gear Solid 2 fans felt when they finished the game, we will move on directly to Metal Gear Solid 3 and cover that for at least one, maybe two episodes in the near future. So we can look forward to that. But I thought we'd start, Brian, by I think it's been a couple weeks now, but if you would just recap some of your experience finishing this game, which is, I know a lot happens in the last few hours. So there's a lot to cover, and I imagine we might have to kind of collaboratively piece together the outline of this game's plot and just sort of second half inversions and loops, So yeah, what were your what I mean, just initial thoughts here? Like, what did you think of the second half of the game?
Yeah, so I think I can't so at this point it was several weeks ago, right? So it's a little strange because we could have done pretty much immediately another episode, but I think we had our guest episode and then we wound up doing a kind of more grab bag episode. But I finished this game, I want to say at least a month ago or almost a month ago. Although that might be wrong. But the second half, I think, came much more quickly in terms of playing through it. The first half, I know that when we spoke about it last time, we were speaking a little bit more in the abstract, and I was talking a little bit about how unintuitive the controls are. But I think, one of the things you mentioned is that the controls feel, I forget the term you use, but that they feel really familiar to you, and I think at this point they do to me as well. That being said, I still haven't played anything that really controls in this way, but especially since I've since mo both moved on to Metal Gear Solid 3 and completed it, the controls are just um, really familiar to me by now. But anyway, I think so. When we last talked, I had just gotten up to the part where you encounter Stillman or Stillman, which is definitely less than halfway through the game. So I think I to get up to that point took a while. I think partly because I was maybe sort of savoring it because I hadn't really had, again, I'd played this game or was at least around people playing this game in the past, but I hadn't played through the whole thing myself. So I think I was kind of taking my time with it, which is what I tend to do in the early stages of a game I know is going to be good. I just kind of will take my time with it. But once I hit sort of the middle part and got used to the controls, I found that the controls are um, maybe difficulty is something we can talk about because these games are difficult, but in a way they're also like not very difficult, I think. Like the boss battles in particular have almost like a gimmick difficulty that can actually be quite easy. But yeah, once I got to that sort of middle part and started, I think there's something that happens where the game sort of sheds some of its opacity and you begin to, even as things technically get more opaque, you begin to like be able to read them or interpret them a lot more
Hmm.
easily. Now, the question of tone is still something that I still have as a question, but I do think that, the crazy stuff that happens in the game becomes maybe a little bit less surprising, though, uh, or maybe I should say, maybe it has less novelty, but retains its surprise or something like this.
Hmm.
So I will just I guess I'll just kind of say because I'm sort of rambling here that I love the game. I mean, I've played through. we'll save Metal Gear Solid 3 obviously for another time. I'll say that I probably liked playing Metal Gear Solid 3 more, but I liked the atmosphere of Metal Gear Solid 2 a lot more. Um, but yeah, I loved, just playing through the area. I think that as we've spoken about before, the kind of limited scope of, where you are in the game is much to its credit. Like I think the kind of repetition of even crisscrossing some of the same places a few times is something that just really worked for me in terms of the plot, but also even like how those areas change as you go through them. And so yeah, I'm happy that we started playing these because I just loved it.
That's great. I think I should add for the listeners that you haven't played Metal Gear Solid 1, right?
Hmm.
So this is you're a fascinating case study in the player who's going into a game that now that maybe it's not as clear if you don't have the background, but a game that for say 80% of its playtime is operating as a pretty radical parody and um, simulacrum of Metal Gear Solid 1.
Hmm.
And so for me, in my first time playing the game, I was incredibly disoriented and sort of disturbed, but also somewhat reassured by these structural similarities with the first game that are really quite on the nose. Like you can't play the game without seeing Metal Gear Solid 1 in its structure, just down to the basic idea of like infiltrating by water. You swim up, like in the famous opening of Metal Gear Solid 1. You fight these this gallery of freaks, bosses. There's a cyborg ninja. You fight a Metal Gear. Like these are just like the basic outlines of how one of these games is structured. Um, and I almost hesitate to get into this now because it's such a huge issue in the game, a huge part of its legacy, and artistically, it's sort of what makes it remarkable. But I guess I'll just broach the topic by saying this is it's a weird game because it's you know for many players, for most players, it's playing on the fact that you expect Metal Gear Solid 1. Um, and in a way does this switcheroo at the end where it's like, ha, you wanted more Metal Gear Solid 1. Well, you got your wish. It's a kind of devil's bargain. We made a game, or this is a game where the villains have intentionally recreated Metal Gear Solid 1 for you to brainwash you, you know. Um, I'll say just I'm going to cut myself off here, but I'll say just in a quick preview of the our next podcast, what I assume is going to be our next podcast. Um, that structure is replicated again in Metal Gear Solid 3, but without any self-consciousness.
Hmm.
So one thing that's really striking about Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3 is that we again have solo infiltration. We again have a gallery of freaks, right? And then we fight the giant metal machine. But in that game, there's no alibi of, oh, this is all an elaborate sort of conspiracy simulation to, recreate this virtual experience. Partly because it's the 1960s, right? There's the same sort of thematics of the digital and the simulation just aren't quite there yet. But um, Metal Gear Solid 2 kind of naively recreates what's essentially Metal Gear Solid 1, whereas Metal Gear Solid 3 naively recreates Metal Gear Solid 1, whereas Metal Gear Solid 2 does it in a knowing way, does it in a parodic or subversive way, and yet one could ask, having played Metal Gear Solid 3, whether Metal Gear Solid 2 is also, it's kind of having its cake and eating it too, because it's replicating the first game just in the way that a game sequel does. Like this is just how sequels work. Like this is a trilogy of games and they all have the same fundamental structure. But only Metal Gear Solid 2 motivates that sequel, right, esque formal or sequel appropriate structural repetition by saying, oh, the villains planned this. They planned this game to feel just like Metal Gear Solid 1. So I think at the time, this really I think it would have packed even greater punch, before Metal Gear Solid 3 came out, and I think to some extent diluted or undercut that pretty brilliant move of making a sequel that gives you exactly or seems to give you exactly what you wanted in poison form, which is more of the first game.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there, and obviously a lot of context that I don't have, not having played the first game. Um, I mean, I do think that certainly it's a game that, and I mean this in still a different way from maybe other games where this would be true, because the game is just so kind of both bizarre and like normal at the same time. But it certainly does feel like a game where, you can have that layered experience or those two different experiences depending on your, where you enter into the franchise, I guess. And I also don't know like anything about the Metal Gear games, right? Because those were before Metal Gear Solid, right? There were a couple games in like the 80s.
Yeah.
So I really have no context for any of those or how those maybe are related or unrelated. Um,
They're canon. They're about Solid Snake,
yeah.
and um, I haven't played them, but I think they follow a similar structure. You
Mm.
find a Metal Gear at the end. You sneak through a base, and they are actively referenced, heavily referenced in Metal Gear Solid 1.
Mm.
But interestingly, you're right. They're basically they play no part in Metal Gear Solid 2 other than the figure of Big Boss, who is mentioned a few times by characters. And now strikes me as pretty funny because what is with no context when they start talking about Big Boss, it must be very surreal and confusing. But Big Boss is the sort of god slash father slash mythological protagonist of the entire trilogy in a way, or at least yeah, he's the entire series really orbits around Big Boss, who's the original super soldier. I guess now you've played Metal Gear Solid 3, so you know who Big Boss is, but
Yeah, yeah,
at the
yeah.
time it must have been, I imagine it was confusing.
Well, I already had the sense, and I've like maybe listened to and seen a little bit of playthrough and also heard or maybe read little bits about the games before I played them. And I already sort of, I mean, obviously all the bosses' names, especially in Metal Gear Solid 3, are all the something, right? Like the whatever. Um, but one thing that really strikes me or struck me especially playing Metal Gear Solid 2 is that it does feel like a big game of chess, and I think this especially gets like borne out at the end of Metal Gear Solid 3. And in terms of like cyclicality and how different characters, become a different character or change allegiances. I mean, there's plenty of like double and triple crossing and weird alliances that are formed and then kind of unform. And I suppose, I mean, one thing to talk about is how, as Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2, there's just this total. I mean, maybe it's a good way of getting back into that question that we've talked about with like Bloodborne and stuff before. This total ambiguity about what the character knows or what the avatar, knows or doesn't know, because it's such an overdetermined question throughout the game, and yet it seems to still be like totally uh, a mystery basically until, near the end of the game.
I think even at the end of the game, it's still somewhat unclear to my memory, like whether Raiden was knowingly repressing his past as a child soldier, for instance,
Hmm.
or whether he had actually just forgotten it. And had to be informed of it by through Solidus Snake once you get to Arsenal Gear. And I'll just say again, just quickly for our listeners by way of framing for those who haven't played it, the bulk of this game, the kind of like core Metal Gear Solid 2 experience is, let's say, 8 hours in one location in the offshore oil rig where you're sneaking around as Raiden and trying to save the president and stop a group of terrorists who are threatening to launch a nuke, right? Or no, they're threatening to destroy the oil the oil platform and pollute the surrounding waters off the shores of Manhattan.
Hmm.
Um, and then there's a final section, which is like 2, 3 hours, set in Arsenal Gear, which is a digital super floating fortress thing. It's kind of unclear what it is.
Yeah.
Underneath this oil platform that was really turns out to be a shell. It's called the Big Shell, tellingly. It's a shell oil platform that's disguising the creation of this giant super weapon castle. And that part is really crazy and almost like that demands a whole other conversation. But I just want to flag this like this sort of stark distinction between these two sections. To my mind, stark distinction between these two sections of the game.
Well, and the first section where you're playing as Solid Snake, right?
Right, right,
In the
yes.
first
And there's a
section.
prologue, and one more thing to note there is that the continuities with Metal Gear Solid 1 are much stronger. Sorry, there are certain continuities that are much stronger in that tanker section.
Yeah.
And I think I mentioned last time that the trailers, the promotional material for the game implied that the whole game would be like the tanker section, i.e.,
Right.
playing as Snake, reenacting sections of Metal Gear Solid 1 unironically,
Hmm.
um, uh, fighting bosses as Snake, battling a jet as Snake instead of battling a helicopter, which you do in Metal Gear Solid 1. And all of that's a lie. That's all not actually in the game. Um, Metal Gear Solid 1 and the tanker section also share like a continue screen. They share music cues, whereas playing as Raiden does shift the sort of aesthetics, the UI, or at least the ambient kind of system flavor shifts it more radically from the Metal Gear Solid 1 model.
Yeah, I have like a maybe a half-formed thought that maybe I'll try to this is sort of related, but now I'm thinking about how the game is unclear or how and why the game is sort of unclear and it and maybe we can also think about this in relation to how literature can be sort of unclear or complex, which I think are two different things, right? Unclearness and complexity. Um, but I had the sense when I was playing through, and really trying to pay attention to cutscenes and trying to, I wasn't taking notes, but I was trying to really try to remember what was going on and who these people were and what the general plot was. And there's a way where the plot felt totally opaque, even though it's so simple, right? Like it's so basic and so simple that it reminded me of, I don't know, being a kid and watching a movie, some kind of thriller that's like a political thriller, and everything in it seems really unclear. And yet, when you actually like sit down and think about it, it's a very simple thing that's happening. It maybe just seems unclear because it's so, I don't know, grandiose or something, or seems so unlikely. Like I think about this in terms sometimes of like even something like the Christopher Nolan Batman films, right? Like what big things are happening in the background that are kind of like the political or quasi-political things seem kind of unclear to me still just because they seem like they're given more complexity than they really have. I
Hmm.
don't know if that sort of makes sense to you at all, but that's kind of how I felt playing through this game. It's like nothing that's going on is really that complicated. It's just like some bad guys, across history did some kind of conspiracy, and then where it gets complex is how the particular players in that, so the particular, I guess to go back to the chess metaphor, the particular chess pieces or pawns, their relationship to one another is what's complex, but the actual larger structure is not all that complicated.
You may be the first person to say, at least the first person that I've ever heard say that Metal Gear Solid 2's story is not actually that complicated, but I think it's a brilliant take because in a way you're right. Like in the broadest outlines, we could say Metal Gear Solid 2 starts as a Michael Bay terrorist, scenario.
Mhm.
And the big twist, which for many, and especially at the time, felt like we'd just completely gone off the deep end into pure postmodern confusion, and paradox. But the big twist is just that, like, this is actually a game about the Illuminati. It's a kind of political Illuminati who control everything. And they've set up this scenario. They've set up scenarios within scenarios within scenarios in order to ultimately brainwash, mind control the world population. So when you put it like that, it sounds pretty conventional, actually, even rather tropey. Despite the fact that that latter scenario is itself a generic departure, I think, from the initial stop the terrorists plot that we think that we're in. So there is a sense of like we're still in genre fiction, we're still in thriller territory, but we jump from something like I don't know, classic spy, war games, um, uh, plotting to something more like, I guess, something more ideas based, right? More paranoid, more. I don't even know what the comps would be because I don't read enough of this kind of work or watch enough of movies, but um, something closer to sci-fi, even, right? Like the government's being controlled by AI entities and whatnot. Um, so I think you're right that there is a core simplicity, a core generic kind of tradition that's being gestured to here. I think in addition to the complexity of the motivations, though, there's also a complexity simply on the level of layers of reality. That one of the huge, like one of the core themes of this game is just this Russian nesting doll structure of created scenario within created scenario within created scenario. So like just to try to map them out in my mind, I'm probably gonna mangle this, but uh, so we have the video game. Right. Wait, which one? It's like, do I want to start at the top or do I want to start at the bottom? Maybe I'll just list them unsystematically. We have the recreation of Metal Gear Solid 1 that I mentioned before. So the Patriots or the Illuminati, digital, AI Illuminati have created this reenactment of Metal Gear Solid 1, ultimately to see if they can control player behavior and human sort of desires and even capabilities. We also have the initial scenario, which is terrorists have seized this civilian or seized this non-military site and are threatening to kill hostages. We have the final revelation that this scenario is about it's the simulation for societal sanity or something like this grand AI kind of very meta scheme. We also have the game itself, right, that we're playing, and then we have the fact that Raiden literally became a soldier by playing Metal Gear Solid 1 because he's like trained in all the VR missions based on Metal Gear Solid 1, i.e. the video game. In the canon world of Metal Gear, there are these you don't get them in Metal Gear Solid 2. Actually, maybe you do in the remaster, but they're actually called VR missions where you go into these virtual reality blocky sort of stages and perform, whatever challenges, which is supposed to be how soldiers are trained or certain soldiers are trained. So there's VR in the game, there's the game itself as VR. There's a lot of blending between the two insofar as like Metal Gear Solid 1 becomes both the digital artifact that we, the players, are familiar with, but also a set of fictional uh, VR scenarios within the diegetic world of Metal Gear that Raiden himself played. Like Raiden didn't go to the store and buy Metal Gear Solid 1, but he essentially did, by playing the Shadow Moses challenges in his VR training. So for me, it's like actually less character motivations than the constant oscillation or jumping between these various levels, which is very self-conscious. And ultimately, I think it's a little bit uncanny. It's not just reflexivity or self-referentiality, but just the level of, or the question of which level are we on right now and which one do I need to take seriously?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I have, not only jumping between levels, but also jumping between like identities and allegiances too. And I think there's an easy way to understand that. That's this kind of we might call it a strong interpretation, but I think it's actually a weak interpretation. We see a lot in literary scholarship and I'm sure in game scholarship as well. That would be to say that that's therefore about this kind of nebulousness of subjectivity or something, which is just like a cat feels to me like a catch-all thing, which might be true, but reducing a game or a narrative to that just feels a little easy, you know? Um, I think that what's happening instead, and this is where, I mean, it's kind of funny that I brought up the Garden of Forking Paths when we talked about it last time, because I mean, again, I'll save this for later, but that's really, I think, the ending of Metal Gear Solid 3 totally feels very much like the Garden of Forking Paths by Borges. Um, but I don't know. I don't think it's about this kind of like ultimate, or not only about this kind of ultimate neutrality or what's the word? Relativity of these levels or positions. It's more about how each particular instance is real in what it's dealing with, right? Like as the character, you can't know that these things are like a simulation, or you can't know that this person that you're, talking to or whatever is going to double cross you, or that they're actually somebody else or something like that. And so the naive way that you need to approach that actually does, I think, something really amazing with your engagement with the narrative. Just like in Garden of Forking Paths, there's a super self-conscious narrator, right, who's aware of what he's doing, and we don't know what he's doing until the end. And yet every moment along that path of what he has to do to execute his mission feels like it has these real life or death stakes, even though the outcome is going to be the same thing, right? So it's kind of another version of saying what we were just talking about, which is that the broad strokes of the narrative might feel pretty simple, but each particular moment feels incredibly complex because of the particularity of those moments.
Yeah, that's great. And it reminds me of something that Snake or Iroquois Pliskin says to
Mhm.
Raiden when they first meet, which is that Raiden's like Snake's like, "Oh, you've never been on the battlefield or whatever." And Raiden says, "Oh, I finished all these I finished sneaking mi mission 50, weapons mission 80." Like he's, just a gamer guy. And Snake says something like, "Oh, you don't bleed on the battlefield, right? Like you don't bleed in VR. It doesn't hurt when you get shot in VR." And that, the I think in some sense, I could be totally wrong, but my reading is that you're supposed to take that literally. Like, I mean, take that to heart. The player of the game is being reminded that games are unreal, and this exercise in compounding and escalating unreality is one of the main hooks of the game and one of the things that makes it, I think, really, really remarkable. However, Snake's actually wrong because I mean he's not wrong that you don't feel pain in VR, but he is wrong that there's a distinction between VR and real life insofar as in this video game that we're playing there is no distinction, you know.
Yeah.
Every level, as you say, has the same degree of urgency and the same degree of binary success or failure. So it doesn't matter if we're inside a charade, as Ocelot would say, within a simulation, within a recreation, within a digital artifact. If we slip on pigeon shit or seagull shit and fall into the ocean, like we still fail and maybe we lose progress, right? Fail states are always going to be the same. Anything that we're told matters does matter for the strict purposes of progressing to the next section of the game. So for example, like it's later revealed that it would make no difference if the bombs you go around defusing went off because they're not structurally important points in the big shell.
Right.
But if you blow up one of those bombs, the game will fail. Like you can't blow up the bomb and be, oh, that's weird. Like there's no, I didn't fail the game, and maybe that is telling me something about the plot. Um, so this is just going back to your point just now that no matter how many layers of simulation and unreality we're dealing with, everything is equally real for the player
Mhm.
insofar as any action, if we're told something is important, it is incredibly important, in
Yeah.
the code of the game.
Yeah, I mean, this is something, maybe this is a tangent, but this is something I have a problem with, or something that comes up from time to time in criticism that I find kind of distasteful, I guess, which is it's related to another question that we've talked about too, but there's a sort of analysis or take that kind of instrumentalizes certain narrative techniques, like again, like we said, having characters change identities or allegiances in a kind of sweeping way that isn't very interesting, and therefore also, or not therefore, but also at the same time, this kind of reading anticipates a certain response from the reader or from the player, which is that, what's important about this game is that it's teaching us X, or whatever. Like it's pointing out this thing. And of course the game has, certain takeaways, right? Of course there are things about mind control and AI and all this stuff, right? But when you're playing the game moment to moment, those are not necessarily going to be the interesting things that, I mean, I think we both, prioritize experience when we're reading a text or something, right? Or at least close reading and maybe kind of bracketing the larger structure of something or the larger meaning to think about the salient points at each different moment. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's important, and this is at least what I try to prioritize when I'm thinking about a game like this is something that I'm feeling in the playthrough, which is not necessarily going to be this big sweeping thing, but actually going to be the realness of those moments that are whatever, virtual or simulated or something.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think this will come up more when we talk about Metal Gear Solid 3, but I think so far for me, the series is really successful at doing these kind of so-called whatever postmodern things about subjectivity, but making them really hit, not just as these fun exercises in storytelling, like maybe, related to what we would call a smart game, or something, but as these really poignant moments, and I think also interestingly where these moments really work is oddly, there's maybe a flip back into that postmodern thing because where these moments really work are sometimes where it seems to verge on, melodrama or something, like there are plenty of moments that are just so, I mean, they're so over the top, but at the same time, they're maybe replicating, I don't know, maybe I keep thinking about this idea, but it kind of replicates like a childlike sort of experience of the game. I mean, I guess it's a cliche, but like a childlike wonder at something that we should know, as like so-called educated, readers or interpreters or whatever. We're supposed to roll our eyes at certain moments, I think, right? But also not. And so not only is the game doubling a lot of stuff, but also it's doubling our kind of experience with it, which is again, not an abstract thing. I think that's a real concrete thing that happens when you're playing through these games.
I love that idea of kind of melodramatic emotional intensity and
Mm.
wonder. Can you give an example of, I can think of a few, but I'm wondering if you have one in mind.
Well, there's the moment with is it Otacon and his sister, right? I mean, his sister ends up dying and there's this kind of whole, this guy that you had already killed, right, who comes back, who's like an undead vamp, right, stabs her or something and then needs to be killed again and then she dies um and this is after this is also after you've, really put in some narrative work to get her across this whole oil pipeline sort of thing or whatever, right? You're like sniping all the guys who are around and yeah, there's this whole backstory to, so it's not only just like an emotional moment, but it's a moment that prompts further storytelling, which I think is also to me, I don't know if this is, someone who's a melodrama scholar can let me know, but it oftentimes seems like, when I'm thinking about a a soap opera, for example, or something like that. It's not just that something intense happens, it's that something intense happens and someone has to have a monologue about it, or someone has to sort of like discourse on it for several minutes. And I feel like that, that does happen throughout the game. Interestingly, I think it's a little bit different in Metal Gear 3, so we'll have to maybe keep that as a question for when we discuss that game. But what examples are you thinking of?
I'm thinking of the one that really hits for me is when Liquid Ocelot, i.e., Ocelot, who is seemingly being possessed by the severed arm of Liquid Snake, the villain from Metal Gear Solid 1, uh, tries to shoot Fortune with like 200 missiles. And even though she no longer has her protective shield that has made her seemingly unkillable and lucky because she believes that she's cursed with luck, which is itself absurd and very funny because bullets are clearly changing their trajectory when they approach her, but
Yep.
she keeps everybody understands it as she's just very lucky, you know. It turns out she has this special technology that has been added, sort of equipped to her unbeknownst to her, in the way that we might equip a C4 to an enemy without them realizing it.
Mm.
Um, and even though that has been deactivated and she's been shot with a mortal wound, she still manages to deflect all of the missiles with her magic powers.
Yeah.
Um, that moment is, I mean, it's another generic violation. Like there's no it's excessive in that even the most radical uh, um, departures from realism, from generic realism in Metal Gear can be explained by science magic. So we'll learn that Vamp in Metal Gear Solid 4, which is the proper sequel to Metal Gear Solid 2, has all of these nanomachines, these tiny little, right, bits of tech in his body that are juicing all his capabilities, which allow him theoretically to do all this crazy stuff and to never die.
Hmm.
Um, but this is one case where there's simply no explanation, where fortune just turns out to be magic, and that moment, I replayed the game this past fall, and it really hit for me. When I was a kid, I thought it was so disappointing. I was like, okay, well, oh, so we're just gonna let magic in, and that's gonna be a big plot point. Is like, oh, it turns out that magic's real. But it's fascinating because even on a theoretical level, like, I suppose you could say luck is a form of magic. So it's like a luck is a naturalized form of magic, or quote unquote realistic form of magic, such that whereas Vamp runs on water. And there's no way to explain that other than magic, which could then be justified as his reflexes, whatever. He has some crazy technology in his body. I mean, that still seems ridiculous, but that's at least what the game would say. Um, for Fortune, the only explanation is, oh, actually, she was lucky. Like, actually, the missiles just missed. And in a way, that's an ironclad argument. Like, you could just say, yeah, I guess that's right, but it purifies that undecidability or that indeterminacy between magic and reality, in a way that's like a kind of it's like the game asymptotically approaches magic, but still leaves that little sliver, and the little sliver that allows for magic to exist is luck.
Yeah, or chance,
Or
right?
chance,
And
exactly. Yeah.
so yeah, I mean maybe again this is another point that I don't want to say too much about, but I think chance is also pretty explicitly foregrounded in the third game where with Ocelot, right? He's always like flipping his revolvers around and doing sort of Russian roulette style challenges with people, right? In a really theatrical way. But obviously that's also a way of activating or reminding us of this, this idea of chance, which again, we're reminded at the same time that we're playing something that not only materially was created in an intentional way and was written, of course, but also concerns these kind of deep state plots or whatever, right? Like these really intricate chessboard style, 3D or 4D or however many D chess is going on in the game in terms of like forcing people to make certain decisions by guiding them with an invisible hand, right? I mean, that's really what is kind of revealed at the end of Metal Gear Solid 3 that again, we don't have to get into it, but so at the same time we have both things. And again, this is the Borges point, right? We have chance, but we also have fate or destiny or something like that. Um, and both things are true at the same time all the time, and this is what is really I think a paradox and is kind of impossible to really capture, but is the thing that's operative and is maybe the thing that makes us feel a certain way when we're playing these games, right? Or reading those texts that have that happening. And it also cuts across genre. I mean, this is the really beautiful thing about, again, a text like Garden of Forking Paths, which seems like a kind of wartime spy thriller, but is something else entirely. And I would say something similar is going on with Metal Gear. I think it's more interesting to think about it in these terms than it is to say, "Ooh, it's a postmodern game that's a pastiche whatever kind of, terms we want to use for what it's doing with pop culture and stuff like that. Because I just think we have a million of those that don't really do anything interesting. And to say that about the game would be to kind of do it a disservice, I think.
Totally agree, and I'm just in love with what you just said. So I want to speak a little bit more to Chance, but I just want to quickly flag, th this point about it's a postmodern game, right? Or it's subversive and it's ironic. Actually, it's not. Like I called it ironic earlier, but I meant that in a formal sense, not in a tonal sense, because Metal Gear is nothing if not sincere. It's an incredibly sincere series. This is how Kojima writes as an artist. He's like an incredibly sincere and like emotional guy, and really wants to tackle these big themes with it's almost so sincere that it becomes postmodern or ironic because it gets so goofy. And it's like, how can this guy be so serious about something so goofy? Like a character named Die Hardman in Death Stranding, but he is like, no, Die Hardman he's a very emotional character. Uh, so that's all true, and it goes back to the melodrama point. But I wanted to circle back to what you said about Chance because I just think that's totally brilliant. Like, you're so right that one of the so again, stepping back, I framed the Fortune moment as a melodramatic moment, and by that I just meant like it's kind of like when in the sports movie when like the kid like scores a touchdown and everybody is like he did it, I can't believe he actually did it. Like that's what I meant. Like it hits me on that basic melodramatic level, but. I think we're kind of uncovering the fact that this is actually an incredibly important sort of theoretically and formally exceptional moment. And it's for what you just said because this is a series that is so interested in chance, you know. Partly, again, as you said, because it's Byzantine plots of double crossings and simulations, right? Basically don't allow for chance. Like the idea that you would send a random gamer into who turns out to be a child soldier or whatever, but that they didn't know that. Yeah, so they're sending or I guess they did, but it's not as relevant to the scenario building. If you're sending a random gamer into a terrorist situation in which he's being shot at, right? Um, and making him relive certain experiences from another historical crisis, which is the Shadow Moses incident from Metal Gear Solid 1, including the ninja, including the bosses, right? That allows for no chance whatsoever. It's like the entire game is premised on the fact that on the or that the entire section of let me uh, re find the right words here. The That section of the game's entire plot is premised on the idea that uh, this random guy could survive and progress through all of these escalating challenges without failing, without slipping on bird shit and falling into the ocean, without getting seen and shot. I mean, you die a lot in Metal Gear in my experience. Um, and so it really does it's pretty ridiculous. Like you have to, if you wanted to take a quote unquote realistic lens to the story, it's like what entity would I understand that they're testing the theory that Raiden might survive, but to some extent it seems like everybody knows he's going to survive or expects him to survive in order for other parts of the plan to come into effect. Um, so there's often these cases where an agent, Snake, Raiden, is being manipulated by unseen forces. And those forces want Snake to do exactly what he does, right? Or want Raiden to do exactly what he does. And yet what he does is so astronomically improbable that it seems only the most insane person would build a plot around it. It would be like if you were a conspiracy that's like, we need Bryan to win the lottery but we don't actually control the lottery. But our plan is going to work great when Bryan wins the lottery, you know? Um, and so that part is ridiculous, right? And it kind of crystallizes and intensifies the basic lack of chance in narrative constructions. That, of course, narrative constructions are predetermined and they have no chance insofar as everything is set out in advance by the author or by the creators. But also, right, at the limits of the game or in certain moments, we have extreme chance, right? We have Fortune, who, again, as we sort of talked about, is an embodiment of luck and turns out to be an embodiment of luck that supersedes the negation of chance, right, by the powers that be. The Patriots created her impossible luck by giving her this device, but when that device is turned off, she still has the luck. Um, Likewise, doesn't uh, Ocelot say in his big monologue where he's revealing the Solid Snake simulation, he says, the one thing that we didn't plan on, the only thing we didn't plan on was the appearance of the real Solid Snake. So that Solid Snake being on the big shell is itself the ultimate expression of chance. Even though it's not, because Solid Snake has to be on the big shell because this is Metal Gear Solid 2, you know. But it's a really interesting question, and there is something true in what Ocelot's saying. You know, After all, like their plan does fail because Snake was on the big shell.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, the snake part too is interesting. That's what your commander or whatever keeps saying, like he was not part of the simulation or he was not part of the
Right.
plan, right? So that point is, and again, I think one thing the game does really nicely is show that like retrospective foreshadowing, like that retrospective recognition that you have at the end of the game, that there were all these kind of signals toward the end of the game that you weren't able to read as such at the time.
Mhm.
A couple thoughts though. I mean, I love like this idea of or just what you're highlighting here about the essentially the way that the Patriots or whoever are kind of just telling a big story. Like that, like it makes me wonder, or it kind of prompts the question of why they wouldn't just do like take what they wanted by force, like why do they have to do, because that seems in fact much easier than orchestrating this whole thing, which uh you know, if it were a score, it would be one of those scores that has like kind of holes in it for improvisation all over the place, It'd be just basically like an empty form. Um, and then of course the form is so particular, but it's the form they want, not the form that they can actually control. Um, but yeah, what do you think about that?
Oh no, I just wanted to quickly add that the score would have a little direction that just reads vamp.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, I think the other thing too is that this is also how this is one place where those levels come together, right? Because one of the points about the game seems to be something about like echo chambers or whatever you want to say in pop culture, and I think that's something that, again, we can recognize. We know what that is. We see that all the time. But I think the part of the way that that's activated in the game is precisely by, as we've been talking about, having these melodramatic cliche moments that still are effective, right? I mean, I think the reason that we call something cliche is because sometime back in prehistoric times or whatever, someone did it and it worked. And then people started copying it and it stopped working precisely because it's supposed to do the thing that it does. And so that's when it doesn't do what it does anymore, right? I mean, it's like the same thing as clickbait, right? We no longer click on clickbait because it's clickbait. It's designed to get us to click on it. So therefore we don't click on it, right? I mean, something about maybe this is just my personal thing about being a suspicious reader or whatever, but I think part of the reason that we have the Patriots orchestrating this whole thing is to show us those particular moments of, you know, where an echo chamber both, is ridiculous and is effective, actually, if that makes sense.
That's great. Yeah, and the mention of echo chambers does set up a conversation about Metal Gear Solid 2's ending, that insane, truly memorable and now famous sequence on Arsenal Gear, where you're talking to the glitching AI kernel and you learn about the simulation or system or whatever the word is for social sanity. So I think we're just going to have to cover that in its own episode because there's just way too much there to get into in the time that we have. But I do just want to circle back very quickly to what you said about cliche, suggesting that cliches emerge in prehistoric times. And it did make me imagine a scenario, maybe a Borges scenario, Borgesian scenario, um, where a caveman gathers his family around their cave and starts telling a story, and then like halfway through the story, we realize the family realizes that his story is about the creation of his previous story, or rather, is a simulation of the scenario that was in his previous story. And this continues at a few more levels, such that we do end up with the caveman telling a story that is itself a recreation of the previous story, that is itself a created replica and simulation of the story he told 3 weeks ago. Um, and in that scenario of narration and reception and nested stories, we want to make sure that our caveman family has kept their magic lantern lit.
Definitely. See you next time.